Hi everyone! I'm here today to talk a little bit about my project for this class and to ask some questions so that I can get your input and expertise on sports media in our discussion for this week. My project asks the broad question of how do esports media companies turn people like you or me into monetizable audiences? While traditional sports broadcasters like ABC or ESPN may have their audiences packaged for them through rating services like Nielsen, esports companies that broadcast their events through live streaming platforms like Twitch or YouTube don't really have ratings data that they can use to attract advertisers. So I look at the ways that esports companies attract, define, and monetize their audiences in order to keep themselves afloat. One part of my project is looking at the ways that fantasy esports helps attract and importantly track audiences for esports companies. My case study for this project is League of Legends, a pretty popular video game that many of you may have heard of or even played. What you may not know is that League of Legends is one of the most popular esports in the world, with broadcasts that get more than 100,000 viewers each week and world championship broadcasts that get tens of millions of live viewers each year. The North American League of Legends League, called the LCS, announced an official partnership with the fantasy sports app Sleeper this year, which was the first partnership between a League of Legends league and a fantasy app of its kind. We can think about this partnership between Sleeper and the LCS in many of the same ways that we've thought about fantasy sports so far, as a form of gambling, although Sleeper doesn't allow gambling in the app itself, as a fan activity, and as a highly masculinized second-order game. But I want to think about the benefits that fantasy sports brings for the esports industry, and that's where the issue of data collection comes in. I'm sure many of you have learned about the importance of data to internet companies. Any company that runs an app, a social media platform, an online broadcasting platform, or anything similar is collecting and using user data for a variety of purposes. In the case of the LCS, Riot Games, which runs the LCS, tracks viewer data in a number of ways for a number of reasons, with perhaps the most important reason being to get information about who is watching their games, so they can convince companies like Bud Light, MasterCard, Buffalo Wild Wings, and Grubhub to come on as sponsors. Like traditional sports broadcasters, advertising revenue is key, and collecting viewer data allows the LCS to show advertisers that they have audiences that advertisers want to capture. That's where the Sleeper app and Fantasy LCS come into play. Fantasy LCS is a pretty niche activity, but it's one that has been going on for a number of years on a variety of websites and platforms. Sometimes it's run by startup companies who want to capitalize on esports fans, or by big companies like DraftKings that see fantasy esports as a small but potentially viable revenue generator. For years, Riot Games let the fantasy LCS community go on outside of its control, not really even mentioning fantasy much, if at all, in its official programming. This might be because the number of players is pretty low. Stats about the number of fantasy LCS players are hard to find, but the fantasy LCS subreddit has only 8.2 thousand members, which represents only a fraction of the around 100,000 viewers that the LCS might get on a typical weekend. So the question becomes, why? Why would Riot bother to set up a partnership with an app to facilitate this small fan activity? Sure, it might be motivated by the same reasons we've seen in the case of fantasy baseball or football, because it can help increase viewership. But I argue that a more powerful reason is because Sleeper, the app, allows Riot to capture data about a group of its most devoted fans. Riot Games views collecting data about its viewers as extremely important. It offers in-game rewards for League of Legends players who watch the LCS on the official LCS website, and now it offers those rewards to those who sign up for Sleeper and participate in Fantasy LCS. While offering opportunities for highly engaged fans to interact more closely and intensely with a sport they love might be one motivation for partnering with Sleeper and making Fantasy LCS an official fan activity, the ways that Fantasy LCS fits into Riot Games' larger media landscape and how it fits Riot Games' viewer tracking strategies suggests that fantasy esports fits more in with Riot Games' desire to model itself and its audience capture and measurement strategies after traditional sports companies than it does about Riot's desire to give fans one extra fun thing to do. The example of Fantasy LCS has a lot of details, and it can seem a little bit obscure or arcane to those who aren't familiar with esports or League of Legends. Hopefully, though, you can see the two main themes that I'm trying to draw out. One is the ways that fantasy sports provides a number of major benefits for sports media companies and for sports leagues. And second, the way that fantasy gaming going online makes player data an important commodity in the sports gaming industry that often isn't talked about as much as other facets, such as gambling. So, with those two themes in mind, I have two main questions I'd like us to think about and discuss in class this week. First, what benefits do fantasy sports bring for sports media companies? Why does ESPN, for example, run a fantasy platform and discuss fantasy on its broadcasts? What are industrial reasons for picking up fantasy sports beyond just giving fans another way to engage? And second, what are some ways that sports media and sports gaming companies track user data? What might they use that data for? And how does tracking user data change how companies value their audiences and players? For this one, you might try looking at the privacy policies for a website like ESPN or FanDuel to see what data they're tracking and to see the somewhat mysterious ways that they describe how they use your data. Alrighty, thanks for listening, everyone. If this presentation spurred any sort of questions or things that you're thinking about in terms of esports, data, or anything, be sure to bring them to class so that we can discuss them together as a group. And I hope we can have an awesome conversation about fantasy sports and data in class this week. Thanks again, and I'll see you in class. Bye.